my intuition is this is going to be 10 times the size of 9/11 or 2008.
Wow.
And it was. It was about 10 times as bad as either 9/11 or 2008 in travel. And those two crises were devastating to travel. And this was 10 times the size. Nothing had been this disruptive since World War II. And in World War II, companies weren't really that global back then. Like that, we didn't know what would happen. And so you have to understand that like there wasn't certainty that we would survive. You know, people were using words like bankruptcy. Now this is 8 weeks after we're preparing for the IPO. And I've spent 10 years now convincing myself of how successful we are. I'm telling stories like this, which you only do when you're successful. I told the founding story 1,000 times, thousands of times, which is basically like, I'm successful. Let me tell you how I got really successful. And now I'm about to lose everything. And it was very harrowing. And Ken Chenault calls me and he says, this is your defining moment as a leader. And I remember this quote by Andy Grove. Bad companies are destroyed by a crisis. Good companies survive a crisis. But great companies, they're defined by the crisis. And that rung in my head when Ken said, this is your defining moment. And I said, this is not going to kill us. We're not going to go bankrupt. We were not killable in 2009. That's why you and PG funded us, because we were cockroaches. Well, we're going to be cockroaches again. We are unkillable. And I realized the most important lesson in a crisis. This is surprising. Do you know what the hardest thing to manage in a crisis is? It's not intuitive. The hardest thing, if you're a leader, to manage in a crisis is your own psychology. It's not the people. It's not the market. It's not your money. It's your own psychology.
I was going to say your employees' morale, but it's your own psychology.
You need to keep the employees hopeful. In a crisis, what do people look to in a crisis?
The
People
leader.
don't look to data.
Yeah.
They don't. No one looks at data in a crisis. It's happening too quickly. There's a fog of war. So in a crisis, we tend to look to a leader and we look at their face. And if they're confident and they're optimistic and they say, here's where we're going, and people want us to exist, and maybe we won't be as big as we used to, but here's why, then that creates hope and optimism, and not optimism that's blinded by some delusion, but optimism that's rooted in some fundamental facts of why we deserve to exist, and we're going to get through it. Then that creates the mentality that you need in a crisis, because you need to be optimistic, you need to be resilient, you need to be creative. It's super hard to be creative when you're pessimistic. And you need to be creative because often you have like two bad choices and you want to find the third path. And you need to keep going. It's a ship and it's got a lot of water in it. There's a hole in it. And you got to bail the water out, plug the hole, and then steer the ship. And if what you need people to do is to keep going, don't stop. So we went from this mantra that every week counts, to every day counts, to every hour counts, to every minute counts. 1,000 of us got in a foxhole. I had intensity that I hadn't had since Y Combinator. That intensity of Y Combinator, I recreated Y Combinator with 5,000 people.
How'd you do that? Tell us how you did that.
The first thing we did is I stepped up in communication. I was totally open and transparent. I told people that like people were predicting that we're going to go out of business. And instead of hiding the fact, I embraced it. But I said, but we're not going to go out this way. And I basically told them like, we're going to survive or we're going to die trying. I did weekly all hands Q&As, which I was advised by some people not to do because it seemed like we were going to do a layoff. And people were like, well, why would you do all hands? Every week you're going to get asked about layoffs. And I said, let them ask. And I'll tell them what I really know. And so I decided to be totally open, to take the employees on the journey of the crisis. I remember like watching like leaders in crisis, and the best leaders in crisis are present and they're taking you on a journey every single day. And I said, I'm going to do that as well. And I was really supported by my co-founders, Joe and Nate. The next thing I did is we did a daily stand-up every morning and every night with my executive team, which we did during every Sunday. I did a board meeting every single Sunday,
Wow.
like during Y Combinator. And
Wow.
we stepped up communication. I called every board member every week, every executive every day. I was on the phone from probably 8 a.m. to 1 a.m. It's like the following morning, right? Probably worked 18 hours a day, every single moment, every day. We had a bias for action. When we did this board meeting, the first thing I did is, okay, so how do you make decisions in a crisis? The problem with crisis is people get paralyzed because they don't have data. And so you have to lean on something in a crisis. Well, what do you lean on? You have to lean on principles. In other words, in a crisis, you make, I don't think, business decisions as much as you make principle decisions. Because a business decision is like, here's the data saying, and so based on this data, here's the decision we should make. You don't have that in a crisis. A crisis is like the building is burning. And there's something incredibly clarifying about a crisis where all the distractions, like a lot of founders do fake work. Like you do meetings and the meetings don't really matter. And like you meet external people and you do like internal things. There's something about a crisis where suddenly like only what matters becomes really clear. And so then I said, like, we need to focus. And so if your house is burning and somebody says you can only take a few things out of the house, what do you take? I had to do that. We had to do that. I would do 10-hour Zoom calls.
Wow.
I would
What?
sometimes, I would do a meeting on Zoom, and it was a 1-hour meeting, and it would sometimes go as long as 10 hours, one meeting. Sometimes I'd have to go to the bathroom. I'd hold it for hours.
Yeah. That sounds
Which I don't
brutal,
advise doing.
right? So
Brian.
like crazy. And we would, but remember, like, if somebody told you that you're going to lose everything, like that's the context, and everyone's fearful. Investors are freaking out. Not everyone, but a lot of investors are freaking out. They're going to lose all their money. Employees are afraid they're going to lose their jobs. Hosts are freaking out that they're not going to get paid. Guests want refunds. And so every stakeholder is kind of like freaking out at the same time. And suddenly in a crisis, you feel your responsibility like you've never felt before. It's not like I had more responsibility. It's just that when everyone is depending on you, you suddenly feel it. And the thing about that is that was a growing up experience for me. I felt, in hindsight, I was pretty mature before the crisis. And I felt like now I'm like 41 going on 61 because that crisis really made us grow up. And I decided, like Y Combinator, what kind of leader do we want to be? What kind of company do you want to be? And the first thing I said is I'm going to embrace getting back into the details. When we ended up doing a layoff, we didn't do a systematic layoff. I reviewed all, like, I think it was 7,000 employees.
wow.
One by one.
Oh my God.
And I said, like, if you get laid off, it's because I knew who you were and I made that decision. I know that can sound heartless, but I think it's more heartless to be separated from your decision. I'm going to get emotionally invested and I'm going to make my best decision and I'm going to live with that decision, but I'm not going to get emotionally detached from this. I'm going to be totally focused. We shuttered 80% of our products. We ended up turning over half our executive team. Like half my exec team left. And we brought in, obviously, new people. And we removed our salaries. We refunded $1 billion of customer deposits that, though people couldn't get refunds. We overrode host cancellation policies. Then hosts were pissed off at us. So we took $250 million off our bank in our bank, and we sent it to hosts when we're burning money.
Yeah.
Then we raised $2 billion of emergency debt financing. A lot of people were recommending either we sell the company or we, not a lot of people, but some people recommend you either sell the company or we raise emergency financing equity at like 10 billion or 15 billion. But that would have had like extremely onerous terms in it. Basically, the equivalent of like a really big down round, which is extremely dilutive to the existing shareholders, a recapitalization of the company. And so we took this really big gamble to do debt, which you're usually advised not to do unless you're really bullish about the future. And I said, I'm so bullish, this is temporary, that we're going to do debt, which saved a huge amount of dilution in the company. We've got Silver Lake to do it. They got warrants. They ended up doing really well, Silver Lake and Sixth Street Partners. And then we obviously had to do a layoff. A layoff's really hard to do. I remember a CEO once telling me, like, the hardest thing you'll ever have to do as a CEO is a layoff, and everyone has to do it at least once. For a company like ours, though, our mission was belonging. Like, you belong.
Yeah.
And now you're doing a layoff. And so that was like very, very difficult for me. and for us, but we had to do it. And, we tried to do it with compassion. We tried to do it uniquely. I wrote this letter that was like just maybe uncharacteristically open. I always in a crisis say, do more than is expected of you. I think a lot of times in a crisis, people do half measures or they do what people expect. A crisis is the one moment you have permission. It's your one time to be bold. A crisis is your defining moment. And if you just imagine, what do people expect of me? Okay, I'm going to do more than that. The world's paying attention. You have that opportunity. And that's always been my guiding principle. And then I wrote out a bunch of principles like act fast, preserve cash, act with all stakeholders in mind. Don't be villains. Win the next travel season. Got everyone rallied around these principles. And then the way I keep employee morale high is every week you're reselling the vision of the company. Whatever you sold for people to join, now you're reselling that vision. You're reselling that dream. And you're embracing the pain. You're reminding people of people through history or companies through history. I'd retell a story of Apple. They were 90 days from bankruptcy. And I said, it's up to us. If you've ever wanted a chance to affect the outcome of this company, this is your chance. If you ever felt like you joined Airbnb too late after the glory days and after the founding, I want you to know that you're back at the founding of the company. This is like a refounding. This is our chance.
Powerful.
And if this company survives, it's going to be because we built it together. And if we go down together. And you imagine now what you feel. You feel like, well, I have ownership. We're going to do this.
Chills. Goosebumps.
And people started working day and night. We restructured the company. We got back to basics. We got back to the founding ideals of everyday people hosting.
Yeah.
We shuttered most of the divisions. We're now a really focused company. Now we restructure how we run the company. So let me tell you the next chapter. Most startups start and they're like functional. And what I mean by that is like you're an engineer and so you write software. You're a designer. You design the software. You're a finance person. You essentially are responsible for the money. You're a lawyer, responsible for protecting the company legally, making sure you have reasonable contracts and things like that. And so you're a functional organization. And what happens in most companies is they want to be, they want to move fast. And so eventually they realize a lot of decision making is becoming a bottleneck at the top of the company. And so to move fast, they divisionalize the company. And literally, divisionalize the company is exactly what it sounds like. You divide it, and then you subdivide it, and you subdivide it, and you decentralize decision making. And in software, and this is a big thing I would just say to people listening, that sounds like a great idea when you're small. Things that you do to move fast when you're small usually slow you down later. And I'll give you an example. If you subdivide the company in 10 divisions like we do, we had a China division, we had a homes division, we had a pro host division, we had an experiences division, we had a Lux division, we had an Airbnb.org division, we had a transportation division, we had a magazine division. I could go on and on and on. And then they subdivided. And we had this culture where everyone could do anything. People could own their own projects. People picked the teams they worked on, which is like a Google thing. And you democratize data. And you basically share the values of the company. You democratize data. You hire smart people and assume that they'll make the right decisions for the company. And you want to get out of their way and you want to empower people and hire great people and trust them to do their job. Yeah. It turns out, in my opinion, that is all wrong. That it sounds great. It is right for some people. It was wrong for us.
Okay.
And actually, people want constraints. They want to row in the same direction. And so what we did, and I studied Apple, and Steve Jobs came back to Apple, and he shuttered most of the divisions, and he went from a divisional structure to a functional structure. So I said, we're going to go back to being a startup. We're going to have a marketing department and an operations department, an engineering department, a design department, and then everyone's going to work on everything together. There are no longer swim lanes. There's one roadmap, and no one ships anything unless it's on the roadmap. And then I'm going to review every single thing in the company before it ships. And I'll have these things I call CEO reviews. And I review everything every week, every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, or every quarter. And if I don't review it, it doesn't ship. And nothing happens without me seeing it. And I'm not there to micromanage as much as I'm there as an orchestra conductor to make sure that it plays one cohesive sound. And we're going to totally be in lockstep. And what we created was this shared consciousness. And I've never seen people do this that often. I know Apple did it. I know Disney did it in the 50s and 60s. Instead of to giving people different like swim lanes and different priorities. The top 30 people work on everything together. We're not going to do anything more than we can personally focus on. So if I can't personally focus on it, we won't do it. And that means that instead of pushing decision-making down, I pull it in. And the shared consciousness of 30 top people in the company becomes concentric circles. And then the next 300 people develop a shared consciousness. The next 3,000 people create a shared consciousness. And it's like a solar system rather than a pyramid. And that was the way we rolled the company. I also embraced getting in the details. I lost the sense of the details. I would spend like 10 hours in a Zoom going into the finest details. When we did the S1, I personally wrote 14,000 words of the S1 myself. At some point, somebody made the joke, if I keep editing the S1, I'm going to turn it into Catcher in the Rye. That it was going to be like a required reading in high school at some point. It was about embracing the details, that I only hired experts, that no one was just a manager, that if you're an engineering manager, you had to code. And if you can't code, it's like being a cavalry general and you can't ride a horse. And so if I am in a meeting with you and you don't have the answer, you need to ask somebody in the meeting, then your scope's probably too wide. And so I created these verticals. And basically, I guess what I'm getting at is I basically ran it like a hardware startup. I ran a giant software company like a hardware startup in one sentence, or the marriage between hardware and software. Because in hardware, you can't just ship anything all the time. You have to like be thoughtful. You have to know what you're building. You have to make sure you build the right thing because you have to invest in tooling. You have to manufacture it. And then if you make it, you have to market it, because if you don't market it, it's going to be on a shelf and no one's going to buy it. And actually, it turns out this discipline is great for software. Because why is it that when we look at apps and we feel like I want to move fast? I know, okay, you want to move fast. Well, how come? Open your home screen, look at all the apps in your home screen, and ask how much they changed in the last year. And the answer is hardly any of them have changed. Not to pick anyone specific. Why is that? Because the processes people use to develop software to move fast eventually become the reason they're slow. And then eventually people do 1,000 things in 1,000 directions. And then what happens is there's no accountability because no one knows what anyone's doing. So people become sometimes complacent. There tends to be bureaucracy because like there's chaos and everyone's hitting certain teams and they feel like a deli with a line around the block, you know, like infrastructure teams or whomever. And then there's politics because you have to advocate, because you like the way to get ahead is to get headcount and get resources. And so
you have your own fiefdom.
And know the fiefdom, the people with the biggest. And so we killed all of that by being totally integrated, being totally into details, having this rhythm. So the moral,
and you emerged stronger. You emerged as a stronger of the company.
The moral of the story is in the beginning of the pandemic. This is a great parallel to YC. At the beginning of YC, we said we are the bad news bears. People said, I remember before YC, I tried to get an investor to invest in the company, and he said, "Why would I invest in Airbnb?" This is 2008. The economy is so bad, even good companies I wouldn't invest in. Why would I invest in Airbnb? Bed and breakfast, he's actually. And when we exited YC, we were voted the best company in YC. As you remember, they did that voting. We were voted among our peers, funded by Sequoia. We never looked back. At the beginning of the crisis, people are writing, is this the end of Airbnb? Will Airbnb exist? People are using words like bankruptcy. We exited the pandemic. To long story short, before the pandemic, we were basically losing money. We were losing $250 million a year, which at our size wasn't bad, but we were basically just below break even. If you include stock-based compensation, we're definitely losing a bunch of money. And last year, we did $3.8 billion in free cash flow. So, you know, I have like unicorns by market cap, $1 billion market cap. And then you got unicorns by revenue, $1 billion revenue. We were a unicorn by profit 4 times over. And we now generate more profit for every dollar we earn than Google or Apple.
Impressive.
44 cents for every dollar we earn goes to free cash flow. And so this is the crazy thing. I never was trying to become profitable. I was just trying to become incredibly efficient. I felt like the analogy is like we were the startup equivalent of the Navy SEALs, not the Navy. That no one wanted to work in the Navy. We wanted to be the special forces. So we embraced having as few employees as possible. We kept the headcount flat for years, basically. If you don't include a call center in India, we still have like 5,500 employees doing like, probably like $750,000 free cash flow per employee. And it's not because we're trying to be profitable. It's because we're trying to make it a fun environment to work at. Yeah. We're trying to move fast. And one of the best ways to slow a team down is to add a person to it, because they bring a communication layer. They bring a tax to it. And so all this stuff was counterintuitive. We've never looked back. Just like Y Combinator. If Y Combinator was our first defining moment that left indelible marks for the next 10 years, but then what happened after Y Combinator? We raised too much money. And most startups raise way too much money. Yep. We hired too many people. We did too many things. We slowed down our pace. And the pandemic brought us back to Y Combinator, but this time with thousands of people. And we said, we're going to be the world's biggest startup, but we're going to stay a startup. And I don't think we ever looked back since. And my job now is not to have to wait for another crisis 10 years from now, to remember those indelible marks and to make sure that we continue to have hunger, that we remember that every minute of every single day counts, that we're in the details, that we're obsessing over what we're making, that we're one like orchestra playing one sound. We're not going in 1,000 different directions. And that is now the culture of the company.